So today we want to talk about P240. It's the second generation of the P200 series camera. So it's the successor to the P200, which was by far our best-selling camera of all time. It's an indoor camera. It's generally rated for averaged ambient temperatures, but it has some great features and updates from the P200 that are now available in the 240. And some of the physical features you're going to notice right away is the tally light on top is now what we call the Mohawk tally light, and it is much bigger and a really key feature when it comes to the second generations of these cameras, but also that the lens is a little bit bigger and that we have an LCD screen on the front. And so this gives us useful data just like when we had the P110, 120 upgrades for the 100 series. The 200 series now at the 240 has that little LCD screen. And on that screen, it's going to give you the name of the camera, the system name of the camera. It's going to give you the resolution and the IP address, all right? So, and the network name for that matter. But it'll give you some very useful information. And we can turn that off if its security is an issue. But this answers that riddle that we've always had about what IP address is on the camera. Well, now it displays it on the front. And if this display is off and it's supposed to be on, then we know that there's a technical problem with the camera. So it's one more quick little troubleshooting step that we have when it comes to working with the P240. And so we have this little screen, and it's super helpful to give us that data. Now, we also have our little network light here on the front that flashes green and amber usually. And so that lets us know that the camera is up and running and ready to go and that it's on. Some people cover this with some gaff tape, and that's totally fine. That shouldn't hinder the use of the camera, but just know that that's a customization that you're making there on the camera. So that's the front of the camera. We want to spin it around here to the back. Now, one of the really great features here is it has this cool little nameplate, which I like, and a bit of a carrying handle, and that's built into the camera itself. And so you can actually use this to carry it, which is very handy because the old cameras, you had to hold it from the bottom, and that wasn't very helpful. And so now we have this kind of useful handle to carry with. On the back, we're going to go from one side to the other. We have the USB stick update drive, which has had its legendary ups and downs through the years. We don't need this now with, generally, we don't need this now with most of our updates. Most of them are done on the WebUI itself, but the USB stick is there. We also have a resolution dial. That is actually for the base function of this camera and is not needed when you're interacting over on the WebUI for the resolutions. And so you don't need to change that. It just needs to stay in default. And I believe default position is 4, if I'm not mistaken, out of the box. So you don't need to change the dial on the back. That can just stay as default. And then we have RS-232 and 422 ports from left to right there that are for controlling this camera with older protocols, serial protocols, and that's fine. However, our whole world is in the NDI game, and so we want to control this camera with one cable, power this camera with one cable, and we want to get video with one cable. So that's the whole point of buying a BirdDog camera, is that we have a single cable plugged in. We're getting all of those elements. There's also then the NDI IP port, which is next, which as you can see is plugged in and the lights are flashing. Next to that is an HDMI out loop out and an SDI port on this one. And then finally, there are some audio jacks here, both in and out for comms reasons, if you wanted to use comms on a camera, which seems odd to me, but some people do, and a loop out on the audio, but also a balanced audio output. And this is an additional purchase. This is the same cable that I believe Atmos uses. I have to, don't quote me on that, but it is an additional purchase. It doesn't come in the box, and so you have to buy the adapter. But that gives you like XLR outputs on this, and so that's helpful if you're into the game of needing to have balanced audio on out of the camera. Then there is that option. Now, I'm always persuaded to just do the camera stuff with the camera and bring the audio in a separate way, but depending on your workflow and your installation, you may need that. And so it's a nice feature to have kind of going forward. And that's kind of the whole tour around. There is also a mounting bracket on the very back, which I could share with you, which is right here. It's integrated into the actual plate of the unit, and so you can thread a security chain to that in case it falls off your ceiling mount or something like that. you could definitely secure it to the ceiling, which was a feature that was requested after the Gen 1s began. So pretty excited about that, and it's a great little camera to get started with. And this is our current generation of the 200 series. It is a larger sensor than the 200, and it has, on paper and technically, a stronger zoom than the 200. The 200 had a 30 times optical, and this one has a 240. However, we're using that larger sensor, it's actually a 4K sensor, to achieve that with a shorter optical lens. And so it is a true 40 zoom, but it is not necessarily like the P240 zoom. It is done with a larger sensor and an optical lens as well. So pretty excited about the offerings here with the 240, and it's a beautiful looking camera. Oh yeah, one last item you may have noticed, this little guy on the back here. This is an additional tally light, but in the box comes a actual little like silicone cutout that you can fit in here. It kind of squeezes in there. And they have numbers on them. And so you can number your cameras that way. And then when you select the camera, that tally light should light up. So let me dump this in here. When you select the camera in vMix or Wirecast or TriCaster, the tally lights up, and that little number would light up as well. And so this is in preview right now, and so it's green. And when I move it to program, it turns red. Let's move over to the WebUI, and we'll walk you through all the features that are also available there. All right, and here we are in the WebUI for the 240. Now, when you get started, you could go to the IP address. You could also get to the WebUI by pulling it up in Studio Monitor and then clicking on the little gear box in the bottom right-hand corner on a PC. On a Mac, you're going to have to go up to the menu and click on, I believe it's called Device WebUI. I should know that by now. But anyways, you could pull it up directly that way. That way you don't need to know the IP address. But in the 240's case, it actually tells you the IP address right there on the front of the screen. And so there's no mystery anymore about what it could be. It is available for you to see when you take it out of the box, which is great. So let's get into the WebUI and have a little look. On the dashboard, this gives us some great general information that we're wanting to know out of the gates. CPU usage, network bandwidth, and what the status of the device is. So it's in encode mode, which of course it's a camera, so it's always going to be in encode mode, and it's streaming NDI. When you see streaming NDI, it means that the camera believes that it is operating correctly and it's streaming it as it should. This status can also say like booting or changing video resolution and things like that. So when it says streaming NDI, the camera believes that it's putting NDI on the network correctly. Our video stream name is Cam, and I'll show you how to change that in a minute. The video format is 1080p 5994, and our audio status is set to mute. The stream info is that it gives us the details, 1920 by 1080 at 5994 at 422 color. Sample rates, audio channels, there's 2 left and right, and sample rate is 48,000. The bit rate fluctuates. Now this is a snapshot. I believe it's once a second, and so it kind of reads back, but it's not like real-time immediate, and it's feeding a website. So it's the WebUI. So this is just a snapshot about average what it's doing. So 135, 125, 120. So we're in there. Genlock status is not active, and that's NDI5 Genlock. I'll talk about that in a minute. Network protocol is TCP, not multicast. And the Silicon 2 protocol on 112, which is the latest firmware to date, is not selected. I'll show you how to turn that on in a minute. Then it just gives us some system details. So the system name, whatever it's registered with the MDNS, the IP address that it's been assigned, 1.65 in this instance, what firmware version and what MCU version. These are super important. So MCU is set to 9, or is on 9, and the actual firmware is 112, which again at time of recording is the latest. The MAC address, which is very helpful if you're trying to do something like IPv6. It's nice to know what the MAC address is. We actually show that on the dashboard. And the network configuration is not static, it's DHCP. Our status is active. That tells you that the NDI chip is functional and, again, is assuming that it's working correctly. And our network speeds were plugged into a 10100 1000 port, a 1 gig port on our network. Now, if I click on any of these options here, it's going to ask me to log in to the WebUI. And so by default, all cameras at BirdDog are BirdDog, all lowercase, all one word. And then it will take you into the page that you clicked on. And there's also a login button at the bottom of that page, which has now been changed to log out since I've already logged in. So now on the network page, this is where we would change it to static if for some reason you wanted to go to static or you're wanting to make life hard. You could go to static and put all those settings in there. Be sure that you do all of these things, so including a default gateway address. Now, static configuration guys will tell you on static networks there are no gateways. It is required for NDI. We found that out the hard way, and so be sure that you include a gateway address, and if you want to cheat, you can use a static address of a Windows machine. That actually does work, but DHCP would be preferred, and reach out to help@birddog.tv if you want to see those network requirements. You put in the IP address, your subnet mask, and your gateway. Now, personally, if you want to make this easy for yourself, use a 22255 gateway, subnet mask. It'll give you 256 addresses, 254 technically, but 256. And if you are getting up to 200 NDI devices, you should be on multicast. You shouldn't be in TCP. So you're safe with TCP single subnet. And if you're going to get bigger than that, we're going to multicast. We don't really need to worry too much about the subnet mask range at that point. The DHCP timeout is a function for the camera. When it boots up and it requests a DHCP, an IP address from the DHCP, how long should it wait? Now, by default, it's set to 20. You can make that a little longer, but just know that if you change that, it's going to make the boot up time a whole lot longer. So if you change that and then you restart the camera, it's going to take a whole lot longer to actually boot up. Okay. Now, the fallback address, I really recommend that you not change that because there's really no need for you to change that, and the entire support team is geared and accustomed to looking for 192.168.100.100, including BirdDog Neuralizer. So there's not really a lot of need to change that unless for some reason you're already using 100.100. Again, I recommend you design your networks not using the 100 subnet. It's a pretty common fallback address, and it would be advantageous to pick something else for 192.168, I don't know, 1 or 70 or something else. And the fallback subnet mask, not too sure why we even allow to change that, but you can if you want. The BirdDog name is the local name on your computer. And so, for example, if I wanted to change this, I could change it to BirdDog.P240. And when I hit apply, I would go to a new WebUI and type in BirdDog-P240.local/. And if you hit enter, it will actually take you to the WebUI. You can change the local name of the device to be something that's more accustomed to what you want to use. It's a very helpful feature, but by default, it's set to the last 5 of the MAC address. And so 99BB7 is the last 5 of my Mac.local. That's what shows up in Studio Monitor. Okay, so when I open Studio Monitor, it's going to say BirdDog dash, in this instance, it'll say 99BB7.local. Well, it won't say .local, but it'll say 99BB7. If I click on that, it will say cam, and if I click on that, it will show me the feed from this camera. More on that in a minute. Transmit method is TCP. You could use our UDP, but quite frankly, if we're splitting hairs at that point, we really want to be talking about a real multicast NDI network. Netgear 424350s are a great option for that setup and configuration. But if you're using a small NDI managed DHCP network, we're going to just leave it in TCP, and that will be sufficient. If you do change it to multicast, these other 2 fields can be manipulated. However, out of the box, especially with the Netgear 4250s and 4350s, you don't need to change them. Okay, they're already designed to function this way because that's the default information in the NDI SDK. So for multicast, so that's already preset for you. Don't need to change it unless your IT department tells you we've had to customize this multicast network. Here is what you put in for the multicast prefix and subnet mask. Okay, and the TTL for that matter. This is where we would turn on Discovery Server. If for some reason you have to run a static network, use a Discovery Server. It's not even optional, all right? Don't even make it an option at this point. If you need to use a static network, you need to be running an NDI, a proper NDI Discovery Server. You need to learn about what that is. That's available on my channel at birddogjohn.tv. But NDI Discovery Server is required for a static setup for long-term consistent use, all right? Good results. So we would turn it on here, and we put in the IP address of that Discovery server. It would be a Windows PC of that Windows PC here, and hit apply. Access Manager is where we can tell this device if there are sources on other subnets, not VLANs, subnets, if there are other encoded sources on other subnets that this camera needs to be made aware of. And primarily this would be for the fallback function of the camera, or for the, no, actually just the fallback function of this camera. So we could put in those IP addresses here. Now the beautiful thing about this is if I hit save, it downloads a little file. And if I open that configuration file, it shows me the format that I need to use to save this text file and then upload it back to this camera. And so if I do this correctly, I could put in 192.168.1.224, right? 225, 223, and 224. So we're going to say save. This is called config2. I'm going to go and select this file from my downloads because that's where it would have gone, and put in config2, hit open, and then hit upload. And if I do it correctly, my new address will appear in the list as the other ones did. All right, so there's my new address. I put it in the text file correctly, and it showed up. The key here with this one is don't put any spaces after the comma. It's very programmer-esque of the engineers to do it this way. There is a change coming to this in the future, but for now, that's how you do it. Same thing would go for the NDI receive groups. Now, say we have a single subnet, but we want to still separate the sources and the decoders to only see each other. So think of it as one big network to rule them all, one proper NDI DHCP to rule them all, but then I have classrooms, and each one has a camera and a decoder, and I just want those two to see each other. We would make NDI groups, and the same thing is applied here. So we would say save, group names, and look, there's a specific format. So I'm going to put in here like Studio 2901. I don't know. But notice the quotations around the name for this one, okay? So now we're going to say save, and we're going to close this. Now let's see if my computer will cooperate here. Hey, there it is, group name 6. We're going to say open and hit upload. When we hit upload, if I do it correctly, my group will appear here on the list, and absolutely it did. Last but not least, we could enable this camera to belong to a group. Now, that first setting was to see a group, okay? See sources in a group. That's what NDI receive groups. It's to see sources that belong to a group. You add them there. To add it to a group, to send the signals to a group, you would put them here. So I could change this to Studio 2901. And I would hit enable. And if I hit enable, it'll add it to that group, and only sources that are in that group will be able to see this 240. Okay, so that's what the groups do, and that's where you manage that information. All right, over to the System tab. This is where we're going to change that password that's default, BirdDog, all one word, lowercase. We can change it here. We put in BirdDog, all lowercase, and then change these two, put a new password in, and then confirm it and hit apply. Really only do this if security is something that you are worried about. And so if this is a closed network and it's just you and your production crew, this is just one more layer of screwing it up. Okay, so change it if you need to. It is an option, but really consider if you need to. That's up to you, and that's very subjective. System update is where we put the .fw file for the firmware update for the camera. And so when I download the new firmware, and it's a .fw, not the zip file, the .fw file, we load it in here and hit upload. It'll take us to a secondary screen. It'll tell us the progress of the update and tell us if there are any errors. This is for a manual MCU update, and so if you have an issue with it, the support team might send you a .bin file. That's where this goes. So if you load the .bin file in there and hit upload, there'll be a little status bar that appears here and tells you when it's done. And then our CEO of the company heard the cries of those on Facebook and integrated a light and dark mode for the dashboard. And so if you are outdoors, the light mode might be a little bit easier to see. If you're indoors like me, I like to use the dark mode. So there we go. Over to the AV setup screen, where we're going to find a few options about audio. The first thing is the output. Do you want to output comms? Okay, are you using BirdDog comms to communicate with your team, and you need this camera to be on that system? The output could be selected to comms. Or you can loop out the audio that you're integrating with the camera. So if you want the audio to go in and get married up to the NDI stream, but then also get looped out and continue on down the channel, there's an option. You can loop it out. You can change and manipulate the artificial gain of the inputs and outputs, but it is a digital gain. It's not an amp. It's a digital gain. So the best thing to do is to have the source already kind of in its final form before it gets to the camera, so you're not manipulating the volume on board the camera itself. You don't have to add digital gain. This is where we could change the OLED screen, and if we wanted to like turn it off, for example, we could click this button and turn off the OLED. So if security is paramount and you needed to do that, you could turn the OLED on and off on this screen. But you can also invert it, which means that if you're hanging this camera upside down, we can click the invert button and it'll post that upside down. So super handy and convenient to use. We can also click device restart. What this will do on this particular screen is the same function as the dashboard device restart. These are the same buttons, okay? Here and here. That device restart restarts the NDI chip, which is helpful if you're making network changes, but you don't want to reboot the whole camera or you don't want a power cycle. You can restart the NDI chip. Everything from the NDI integration onward gets restarted. All right, now there's another version, device reboot, which actually sends a soft reboot to the baseboard, which reboots the baseboard and the NDI chip. Okay, so it does both. It's a longer boot up time. The NDI chip is just a few seconds. The reboot device is a soft reboot. It's not a power cycle. It's a soft reboot of the board and the NDI chip, and that takes about 1.5 minutes or 2 minutes to really get completed. Okay, this is where the fun really starts. The encode settings is where we're going to tell the camera what resolution we want. It's going to tell us what do we do with the audio, whether we want to turn the stream on and off, whether we want onboard tally, all that stuff. Here is where we could manipulate whether or not we want to tell the camera to function at a certain threshold in manual, or we want the camera to just manage its own data. I prefer NDI managed. If I'm compromising on that level, that means my network is probably not going to be good enough to handle NDI. So if you're manipulating the manual bit rate, which is what you would do here, by the way, in manual, if you're manipulating the manual bit rate, you're really flirting with a network not being good enough to actually run NDI at full throttle. This is that stream name. Inside of Studio Monitor, what do we want the camera to be called? And so when I select BirdDog dash, what was it, 99BBF or something like that, when I select that camera, the little name of the camera appears, and it's just cam. But maybe I want to change this to P240. And so I know this is the P240 camera feed, and that's totally fine. We do that, put in a new name, and hit apply. We can also change the video format here. Now remember when I said leave the dial in default when we were looking at the camera itself? Well, we leave it at default and we change the resolution here. And this should change the resolution of all outputs. And so don't need to mess with the switches, all that stuff on board. What we want to do is change it on the WebUI. And so we could the maximum this camera can do is 1080p 5994 or 1080p 60 technically. 1080p 5994, P50, I50, and so on and so on. So you can see the different options here. NDI audio. Do we want audio to be added to the NDI encoded channel? Okay, so the picture itself, do we want audio to be embedded? If you turn it on, it adds a bit of bit rate, not much, but it adds some. If you mute it, it removes that. And so it saves you a little bit on the network side. So that's where you do that here. You can also tell the camera to just stop streaming NDI. And it goes to a screensaver, which is very low bandwidth. Keeps the camera on, but it stops streaming the actual video stream. And so you can turn that on and off here. When you turn it off, it goes to a screensaver. Well, this is where you would choose what screensaver you want it to go to. By default, it's to a BirdDog logo. Maybe you don't want that. Maybe you want to capture a specific frame that the camera is seeing, like a logo or something. Or you just want it to go black. All of those are options here, and more options are on the way, I've been told. But those are the three options in 112. To capture a frame to be used as a screensaver, you click this button. If you click that button, it captures that frame and saves it under that capture option right here. So then if I select capture, it will show whatever it was that I captured. This is where you turn that onboard tally on and off. And so if you want tally information to change the color on the camera, okay, preview and program, you could tell it to do that here. You can also turn it off, which means it will never show tally information. This is not a manual tally light switch. Okay, this is just saying, do you want to light up the lights when the tally information arrives to the camera? All BirdDog cameras accept metadata NDI tally information, meaning that vMix or Wirecast or TriCaster need to send the tally commands to turn on the light. There isn't a manual turn it on or off option. It needs to be sent from your video switching program. Genlock source. This is NDI 5 Genlock, which we won't really go into much, but if you want to select a source to lock to the time code on that device, you would do that here over NDI 5. And you can search for your sources here by hitting refresh a few times and then pulling them up and selecting the source that you wanted to lock the time code to. Again, I'm not going to get into NDI 5 Genlock. It is not like the traditional Genlock, so differentiate between those two, but that's where you would select that source there. And a failover source. So this was when I was saying you could add it to other receive groups. Well, if you wanted this camera, if this camera had a malfunction and stopped encoding NDI, you could tell it to reflect another source on the network so that you don't have dead air. Okay, so maybe you have two cameras, and if one of them dies, you want it just to point back to the other one. That's a good use for failover sources, just in case something goes wrong. You would select that there and hit apply. You can also reset the source list, so that flushes basically the cache, and then you hit refresh a few times and it gets a fresh list off the network. This is why it's important to have an MDNS and a proper NDI network, a DHCP server preferably, and if you're in static, you have to have a discovery server for that function right there. Okay, that's really paramount when we're decoding NDI. Okay, there's that screen. But there's an advanced tab, and in the advanced tab, this is where we set the Silicon 2 options. Now, with Silicon 2, we're able to get an HX source or an SRT source, RTMP, RTSP. We're able to get one of those, off of this camera simultaneously to the NDI and SDI and a bunch of other things. Simultaneously, we're able to select a different protocol, in this instance NDI HX, and then we can say, do we want a constant bit rate, and at what rate do we want that, or do we want a variable bit rate, and we change the GOP size here, the iframe and all that. I like the constant because it takes a lot of the guesswork out of setting this up, and we could say low, medium, high, ultra, or you could say custom and then set your own custom here. The key is the faster or more bit rate you go, the less latency you'll have and the nicer picture you'll have, but it will require more bandwidth. And that's the great question when it comes to, do I do full NDI or HX? Full NDI is the sports car, HX is the economy car. HX does, now some people don't like that analogy, but HX is the most economical use of your bandwidth and gives you the best picture for that bandwidth. Okay? Full NDI does not care about your bandwidth. It will take what it needs to get the job done, but it will give you the absolute best picture and lowest latency. HX3 gives us the option to have variable bit rates and to kind of manipulate it a bit to see what works for us and gives you a lot more control. However, if you're going to ultra, there's very little difference between ultra and full except for the latency. And so if you're going to ultra and you're doing 60 megs, you're probably able to do 140 at that point. That's probably not a big burden for your layer 2 or layer 3 managed NDI network switch, and you might as well do full NDI at that point. But we give you the option for NDI HX. Okay, next tab, cam control. Cam control is where we control everything about our camera. This first page, that's the first tab is called cam control, and then the first tab up here is camera control. So we can control the camera left, right, up, down by clicking on this circle. So I just want to prove that I can move this camera. And as I move the camera, you can see that the yellow light is receiving that information. That's just the network data, it actually processing that. It's just an indication that it's getting those commands. I was just using that little circle here to do that. You could turn the onboard menu on and off, but with the modern day WebUI that we have, you don't need to. So don't worry about that. You don't need to turn it on unless it is on, and that's how you turn it off. This is where we could zoom in and out, so tele or wide, regardless of what you want. And we could change the focus mode from automatic focus to manual focus. And so if you have a specific position that you have the camera in and you want to dial in the focus, you could do that here with in and out. All right. The speed control, superfine, and standard options were added a little bit later on, but this superfine gives you a much bigger range when it comes to dialing in exactly how fast you want the camera to move. These settings are not saved on board the preset, okay? These settings are set in the WebUI, and the camera references those speeds depending on what mode you're in. But it references those speeds, and so I tend to use standard mode, but some guys really like having all the way up to 255, and that's an option there. FreeD is a beta program as of today's recording date. That if you are using Unreal Engine and you're integrating with FreeD, this is where you would put in the parameters for FreeD to communicate with the camera itself. This is where you can set and recall presets if you like. There are two modes for presets. You can select PTZ only, which is pan, tilt, zoom position only, or we can save all the camera settings, well, not all, most of the camera settings, and the PTZ position. This will save pretty much white balance, exposure, a bunch of other things, except for the preset speed. The preset speed in camera mode is recalled here. It references this speed in order to execute the preset. When you are in PTZ only mode, it references this. Again, these speeds are not saved in the preset as of today's recording. They're not saved in the preset. You set them here, and then the preset calls the position of the camera with that speed. Okay? So you can recall PTZ only or camera, and you would really change these when you want to save the position. So here I want to save all the camera settings. I've got it set up exactly as I want. I want to save the camera settings. I'm going to click on camera. I'm going to click on save. It's going to turn green. And then while it's green, I'm going to click the big number 1. And now preset 1 is saved. Now, if I click on PTZ only, and I call preset 1, it's going to call preset 1 with the camera settings because it's saved on board the actual camera itself. It's not saved on the WebUI or on VMAX or anything like that. It's saved on board the camera. So when you save a preset, it's saved on board. It recalls in camera mode. It recalls PTZ and the coloration. And for the speed, it references the pan speed, the tilt speed, and the zoom speed here. When you recall a preset on PTZ only, okay, if I save preset 1 or 2 with PTZ only, and now I click on preset 2, it's going to recall preset 2 PTZ only. It doesn't matter now what that box is clicked. And it's going to reference whatever this was last known to be, which was 20 when I turn it back on. So that's what you need to know about presets. Okay, exposure. This is the fun stuff. This is colorizing your image. And for many of you, you don't have full-time colorists, and so full auto or semi-auto might be in your wheelhouse. However, you'll find pretty quickly, especially with different white lighting options, that you're going to want to learn how to use manual mode. The key here is to try and use as little gain as possible. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to put this image in the little box that's next to me here on the desktop in replace of my picture, okay? So let's go to, let's do that real quick. And I'm going to add this camera, and it's looking at the 240 that's up there with the yellow tally lights on it right now. Okay, so, and I've turned the gain all the way off. Now, when I had it on, it looked like this, okay? Now, also, this is a low bandwidth feed of this camera, just not to flood my network. What I want to do is I'm going to turn that gain all the way down. I want to try and colorize this image with as little or no gain as possible, and I'll explain why in a second. The next thing I'm going to do is I'm running at 1080p 60 or 5994, and so let's use 1/60 as our base shutter speed. Now I'm going to open the iris up slowly and try and accept a little bit more light into this image. So I'm going to manipulate this a bit, and this is wide open. Okay, so that is pretty dark. It's not enough light for the 240 to function. So now I'm going to back off, and I'm going to go down to 1/30. Still pretty dark. Now, I'm looking at a dark corner, by the way, and so it may be better to look at me. Why don't we do that? So let's take a look at, of course, this show is all about me, so let's look at me. Okay. I'm just going to switch over to the 240. There we go, so that you guys can see it's zoomed way in on my shirt. All right, so here we go. All right, so I have studio lights on, and I am shooting at 1/60. So now let's change this to 1/60 because that's where I kind of want to camp out. And again, my iris is down to 2.4. If I zoom all the way out, do I get any more? That is all the way out. So that is as low as the iris will go in this instance. So I have one of two options I could go with. I can increase the gain slightly, or I can lower my shutter speed, all right? I'm going to see what it looks like if I increase the gain. It doesn't look terrible, but it's not great. Okay, if I increase the gain, I'm up to 6 decibels. That image is still pretty clean, and it's not busy. The blacks on my shirt are not super busy. Man, that picture looks amazing. So I like that a lot. Let's go with that for now. All right, so I got 1/60. The iris is wide open. Now, we can manipulate this a little bit and change the iris so I'm not operating at extremes. So maybe like 2.4. That's pretty good. So let's go with that. 2.4. Now, the next tab that we want to look at is white balance. I got to look at this camera now. The next camera that I want to look at, or option, is white balance, because although this image looks pretty good, and my office is green, these are lights, by the way. My office is green. I don't want to operate in manual white balance mode. So I'm going to switch over to user, and I'm just going to do this for funsies and manipulate these like crazy, just to show you that these things, actually work. And what I want to do generally is probably try and get these pretty close. We're really green, so we're going to go head towards the blues. That's too blue. There's my skin tones coming back a little bit. So let's settle down there. And then let's try and, dial this in. Way too red. All right, it still looks pretty cold. Let's bring that down a little bit. Now, one of the things about my shots doesn't look too bad. One of the things about my preference, and by the way, all of this is about your preference. Okay, it's subjective to you. Don't call up the help desk and say, why does my camera look bad? It's like, well, what does bad mean? You know, what do you want it to look like? What do you think the camera is supposed to look like? So just generally, this is pretty close. It's not dialed in, but it's pretty close. So you need to decide what that's going to look like. But I'm going to change a few things on some of these modes. Now, let's go back to white balance. There is a color matrix on board this camera, which means that we can manipulate individual colors if we want with the matrix, and we can also do broad up and down. So if you find that maybe like the reds are too hot, you can pull some of those out. Now, I think actually more the magenta. So let's go this way. Because, I don't look well. I look purple. Let's change that. Let's see what these extremes might do. Ooh, my skin tones are a little bit more appropriate. But you can go in here and you can manipulate the matrix, as you can with most of our cameras, by the way. You can manipulate the matrix. I don't like that level being so high. It doesn't look terrible. It's kind of hard to see in that small screen, but we're making minor adjustments. Me personally, I don't like getting into the matrix too much. I like camping out right here on the white balance and getting it as close as I possibly can. Because one of the things that I want to do, there are some detail options here, and we can leave this in full manual, or we can open up full auto, detail mode, full auto, or we can change all of these, like crispening. You can crank up the sharpness. You can do a whole bunch of stuff here that allows you to really dial in the image. Because this sensor is a lot larger than the 200, we have a lot more picture options. But I'm going to leave that in auto, and I'm going to go over here and just make sure. On the picture settings, by the way, if we needed to hang this upside down, we could totally do that here. We could mirror the image if we wanted to mess with people and pretend like our whole world is backwards. There is an IR cut filter on this, and so if you need IR for something, okay, go for it. And there's a stabilizer. The stabilizer is going to crop the image a little bit, but if you have a really shaky wall with a door that has a panic bar door on it, those heavy doors, There's not a whole lot you can do about that, but for minor shakes, for HVAC issues or whatever, you might get away with setting the stabilizer on. And so that's helpful information there. But what I want to get to with this image is the gamma settings, is because this is where you can kind of set a lot of that, and you can really dial in some of the blacks on the image. And so we're going to do this. Ooh, there's actually a black level on this one, which is amazing. I'm going to go back to 0 here, and I'm going to manipulate this level. Ah, man, this image is just so stinking cool. You can, of course, change this however you want. Obviously, that's way too much, but you can manipulate this however you want so that it'll look the way that you want it to, and so that you get the proper contrast, you get the proper black levels that you want. This camera can do this over the 200, which cannot, okay? So if you're going to buy a brand new camera and you have the budget for it, the 240 is a great option because you have the level of black level control on the camera itself, which will really give you that studio, professional, finished look, okay? Especially if you're streaming. It would be really helpful. Okay, I know I blazed through some of those cam control options, but those are the highlights. This is where we can enable things like scopes, which are free on BirdDog cameras. You pay an arm and a leg for scopes elsewhere, guys, but here we give them to you on the firmware. So when you buy a camera, you actually get it, and you can enable them on the WebUI right here. So we can say on, and it will put the scope on the screen. Now, again, this is low bandwidth, so maybe I should try and, can I change that? Yeah. So here, whoa, look at that. That's such a crazy, it looks so good. So here are the scopes, and this is my histogram. I can change this to waveform. I can make this bigger, by the way. Let's go large. So waveform, many of you will be using histogram and probably vector scope. These are the ones that will really help you dial in skin tone, will really help you understand what's going on in the image, all the way around. So vector scope and histogram, these two are super helpful. There's also RGB parade. That is a fourth option on here. And so this would be great for balancing that color. So let's change this now. Go back to cam control. Let's go back to our color, white balance. And you can see our reds are really low in this image, and our greens and blues are really high. So what do we do when we change this? Okay. Let's go exposure. Oh, sorry. Ooh, this is cool. The reds are low. That's not really manipulating much of the red. That's going the wrong way. All right, that's not super helpful. Check this out. Whoa. It's like slowly dialing in. That's a much flatter image. I mean, that looks really good compared to what I had. This could bring the blues down a bit, but I kind of want to keep the blues and the greens all. Now, it's probably high in the greens because my whole backdrop is green, right? But this would be a great place to balance that image if you wanted to and get you pretty accurate. And it's on board. It's free with the BirdDog camera. Now, scopes are available on all of our cameras. And so if you buy a BirdDog camera, scopes are an option. But the P240 has a lot of control over all of these different options. And so that is where you would turn scopes on. You can see it here on my image. If I cut over, whoops, wrong one. If I cut over to, oh my goodness, I'm lost, to that camera again, you can see those scopes, and we can turn them on and off. So that's program, right? That's the full NDI feed. So we can turn that on here. And then preview. You can also, if you're looking at the proxy streams just as references, and you don't want to use full bandwidth, you can turn on scopes on preview, but not on program. So the full NDI stream goes out without the scope, but the low bandwidth version, which I can change, watch this, I can say low bandwidth in vMix, and guess what appears? The scopes, right? So if I change it from low bandwidth The proxy stream has scopes, but the program doesn't, because the camera is actually outputting two NDI streams, one in program and one in proxy. So there you go. You can also make it transparent if you want, but not too sure why you want to do that. And you can change the position of you can change the position of where the scope is. So say I want it in the bottom right instead, then I can turn that on, and there it is, the bottom right of the screen. So scopes is kind of the last option on the WebUI, going kind of all the way around. And I hope that that kind of walkthrough of the beautiful P240, which is turning into quite a legend here at BirdDog because of the, let me set this up like pretty so that you can see it, turning into quite a legend here at BirdDog just because of its versatility and its really deep, rich functions. Operates over PoE. It's a single cable plugin for video, for metadata, for tally, for audio, for power, for control. We can just open this up pretty easily in Studio Monitor, and maybe what I'll do here is to just give you one final view of that. And so if I cut over to that screen and I throw that 240 up here, check out, there's my studio. You could just control it in Studio Monitor just like this. Look at that. This beautiful, smooth, like ramping motor. It's not abrasive. It's just perfect. And so the 240 is definitely a place and a great option when it comes to camera selection in this market. And hopefully that is very helpful while you're navigating how to use your camera, what all the functions are on the camera, and how to get started quickly. So.